Kia ora te whānau, it's Lieutenant Lyle here. Thank you for your patience as I put this one together. I want to start with a big thank you to everyone that liked, commented, subscribed on the first video. Your reaction has been super kind, and I really appreciate everyone taking the time to go on this little journey with me. I am super excited by today's video and topic. I have a real affinity for thinking about how weapon systems change the way that we think about different parts of history. And I think that in this video, hopefully, we should look at, one particular armor system, and then think about how that inspired what is the Cataphractii armor, or Cataphractii Terminator armor in the 40/30K setting. So again, thank you for being here. Keep the comments coming. Super excited to start covering some of the things that you want to see in the next coming videos. I've got another one coming up right behind this, so really looking forward to that. One of my favorite characters in that one. But with that said, let's jump into Cataphracts and Cataphractii in both the historical and 40K setting and see where we get to on this one. Cue the music. Let's start with the history. So, Cataphracts. What are they? Where are they from? To start with, Cataphract itself is a word with a Greek origin. It actually means, or roughly translates, to being fully armored or closed in from all sides. So you can imagine a cavalry soldier wearing full plate or scaled armor, typically armed with a long weapon, spear, and they even the horses in a lot of cases are wearing kind of scaled armor. There's some really cool motifs or kind of carvings where you could almost think that the horses themselves look like seahorses or something, like they've got fish scales, and that was actually the scaled armor that they wear into battle alongside their riders. So some really cool artwork out there, and hopefully that'll be coming across at the moment. The first time that we actually see the word cataphractii or cataphractos being used is in a Latin writing from Lucius Cornelius Sisenna. He says, the armored whom they call cataphract, loricotus, cuos, cataphractos, vocant, butchered, absolutely butchered. But that's the first time we kind of see it, at least in Western literature. It's actually kind of a catch-all phrase for kind of a class of cavalry. Examples of this, style of armor, stretching all the way from, the Korean Peninsula all the way through to the Gallic tribes. A description of a type of armor or armoring, as opposed to specific time, place, cultures, kingdoms, times. And eventually, a lot of people would think, kind of Roman or Greek legionaries, they didn't actually adopt this till later on. And there are famous examples of Romans falling to armies that kind of used cataphractii or cataphract soldiery, and we'll touch on that later. But I wanted to pick up kind of a real. It's hard to picture without photography, without we've got some art, but the real kind of color description, I guess, the HD that comes through the historical writing. I think that I found a quote from Amicus Marcellius, who was a Roman soldier and historian writing in the 4th century AD, and he had this really interesting quote where he says, quote, "No sooner had the first light of day appeared than the glittering coats of mail, girt with bands of steel and gleaming cuirasses, seen from afar, showed that the king's forces were at hand. Picture in the distance the glint on the horizon, and you can see this army coming towards you as the sun catches their armor." He continues, "All the company were clad in iron, and all parts of their bodies were covered with thick plates, so fitted that the stiff joints conformed with those of their limbs. and the forms of human faces were so skillfully fitted to their heads that arrows that fell upon them could only lodge where they could see a little through tiny openings opposite the pupil of the eye, or where through the tip of their nose they were able to get a little breath. The only spot where these soldiers were vulnerable were literally where they had to see or breathe out of their helmets. Otherwise, they were totally enclosed in metal, and this must have been so intimidating. They could walk into fire, into arrow fire. They could take blows from swords or spear, and the final part of the quote, of some of these who were armed with pikes stood so motionless that you could think them held fast by clamps of bronze. Like they're not even intimidated by the arrows coming down. They can kind of sit through it. And then once you're out of arrows, they can charge you. In historical battles and in antiquity, most of the casualties were when the army turned and ran. So imagine you're up against these, tanks of antiquity. They just absorb all of your fire. You thought, hey, we've got thousands of millions of arrows. There's no way they can get through us. Once they're done, they're tired. They've been shooting for however long. Then this kind of steel wall starts marching towards you, and they're on horses. So if you're turning to run, they can run you down. They're well armed. They're heavily armored. I mean, they must have just been so intimidating to come up against. I'll take my medicine. I mean, there is a possibility I set up this whole channel to attempt to try and quote ancient historians and quotes like Dan Carlin. I mean, it's a high possibility that's the case. I appreciate I'm nowhere near as epic as him, but if you ever need to scratch that historical itch, I highly recommend going and listening to some of his hardcore history series. It's just, I think it's some of the best histories you can wrap your ears around. As I mentioned earlier, these were kind of the shock troops. They were the elites. They were completely covered in scaled armor. Their horses were as well, and they were typically seen as the heavy assault force for the nations that kind of deployed them. But as I mentioned, they stretch and transcend cultures. So there are examples of Asian cataphracts right through to the Eurasian steppe and into Western Europe. It wasn't until much later, though, that the Romans started to assimilate these or copy this style. It's kind of a case of if you can't beat them, join them. One of our best examples of cataphracts kind of in the historical record fighting against Western army comes from 53 BCE at the Battle of Carrhae, where we see Croesus, who's not really known for his generalship in the field. He's better known for being super wealthy. The saying is, rich as Croesus. He was a Roman general in the field around the same time, and actually, a competitor and sometime ally of Julius Caesar before he became Caesar. So we kind of come down through the histories. We get a fairly detailed account of this Battle of Carrhae, where the Roman force was actually outnumbering in typical kind of Roman formation. They kind of assumed that it was going to be a walkover here. Larger force, very well organized, and a well-known general kind of at the helm, and they lost. They were turned back by a force under a Parthian general called General Serenus, and this force had about 1,000 cataphracts that were part of the force opposing them. It's hard to say, but there might have been archer cataphracts, which is kind of an interesting combination of two weapon systems. But it said there were about 1,000 in the field that day, and they turned back a much larger Roman force. And this kind of had a trickle down effect. We still talk about it today, so it must have been a significant battle if it's over 2,000 years ago. But it's also suggested by some historians that, this had knock-on effects, as kind of the late Roman Republic era was coming to an end, and we see Julius Caesar establish the Roman Empire and his leadership away from the Republic. So, um, super interesting example there of how a smaller force with a superior weapon system was able to overcome even an organized but larger force. Cataphracts don't really, there's no decisive battle where they go away. There's examples of cataphracts in the field from the earliest days of antiquity right up until kind of the high middle ages. We can pretty clearly see the influence of the cataphracts influencing European knights as we would think about them, kind of the knight on horseback with the lance, which is kind of a European trope. You see them as elite forces, but perhaps not in the same numbers as we would think of, where you've got 1,000 in the field engaging a Roman army. I kind of think of European knights as the cheaper cousin to the legacy of cataphracts in the field. Maybe that's unfair, but that's how I think of them in my head. Let's jump now to Cataphractii Terminator armor in the 40k setting. Like my previous video, I appreciate a lot of the main uses of Cataphractii armor are seen in the 30k setting. It's still part of the same universe, and I think that the Cataphractii armor is my favorite, at least in terms of the aesthetic, the way that it looks, the sculpts that we see, especially in some of the 30k characters. I think they're fantastic. I love the high shoulder pads and the leather tassels. They were called pierogies. So really brings through that Roman aesthetic. We're very heavily armored and taking that Roman influence, I think, is super interesting. Let's talk about Terminator armor in general, its origins, where it comes from, and then how we get to the Cataphractii armor and its use in warfare. So Terminator armor itself has been around in the 40k setting for a long time, developed to allow these colonists to be able to operate in hazardous environments. They're able to maintain their ships as they move out into the stars on their colony planets, being able to operate in hazardous environments, either natural or as a part of the colonization. These suits were primarily designed for industrial and exploration purposes and not necessarily for combat. As we get through to the Age of Strife, these technologies started to be used increasingly for defensive and offensive. It wasn't until the Age of Strife that the idea of a power suit of armor starts to come in, and the Mechanicum of Mars starts to have some influence. The Great Crusade, where we start to see the first examples of Terminator armor being used for Space Marines. Previously, the settlers would not have been Space Marines. They would have been normal humans, not gene-enhanced superhumans. So as the Space Marines become a part of humanity's push back out in the Great Crusade, Cataphractii pattern Terminator armor was one of the developments that was brought into play by the Mechanicum and the Emperor of Mankind to be able to really provide Space Marines with the ability to breach and siege in kind of environments where maximum protection was required. So you can imagine boarding operations or big sieges on hostile planets. The Cataphractii were used to provide the most protection possible for those Space Marines as they were going into battle there. I do love the way that those models that are shown on the tabletop so often have really brutal close combat weapons. The classic power fist, but also the chain fist, and my favorite, which is the double power claws. They've often got heavy melee weapons and kind of that that patented double bolter. I love the one with the double drum barrels. I think it looks fantastic. The next big step in the lore is then looking at their role in the Horus Heresy. The power armor was fairly well established across the legions by the time we get to the Horus Heresy. So you do see some legions with fantastic elite units where they have specific Cataphractii classes. I think of the Emperor's Children. I think of things like the Blood Angels, and actually, Blood Angels is more Tartarus pattern, isn't it? I think of things like the Death Guard and some of the Imperial Fists, who have fantastic sculpts of these very ornate suits of Cataphractii armor. They have so much character. They have that character that the 30k setting really pulls through. Post Horus Heresy, we see less Cataphractii. It was very hard to maintain. It was expensive to build, and it was slow. I mean, Tartarus armor was kind of developed as a faster, less protective alternative to Cataphractii, but really what we see, and I guess somewhat similar to the Cataphracts in our history, is that they were kind of replaced, and the Dominus pattern Terminator armor starts to come out towards the end of the Horus Heresy and is really seen as a much more mobile version of Cataphractii armor. It's a later version, and we haven't really seen much develop beyond Dominus pattern, but that becomes kind of the dominant pattern of Terminator armor. Still very rare in the 40k setting. Terminator armor itself is hallowed, kind of very rare and venerated amongst the Space Marine legions. But Cataphractii armor itself is even rarer. It's quite often only seen in ceremonial or honorific uses in the 41st millennium, and would often be put aside for only the top echelons of chapters, maybe a Space Marine chapter master or some of the top captains in a chapter would be able to kind of don the suit for ceremonial occasions, but it's very rarely seen on the battlefield unless you're kind of using it as part of your rule of cool on the tabletop, which chapters tech marines will consider these as sacred relics and spend a lot of time maintaining them, even if they don't get out on the battlefield that much. Let's bring it all together as we think about Cataphracts on the historical battlefield and Cataphractii in the far future. I think I can draw quite a few comparisons. Obviously, the Cataphracts of old have inspired the Cataphractii of new, heavily armored, fully encased suits of armor that make them, nigh on impregnable on the battlefield. Perhaps Cataphracts in the historical setting were more mobile than Cataphracts in the 41st millennium. They kind of got phased out, one, because they were really expensive, they were hard to make, and perhaps some of that knowledge and technology was lost. But they were both kind of replaced by but kind of cheaper replacements, easier to mass produce, and more cost effective than these kind of very sacred one-off suits or small batch. I guess you can still get units, entire units of Cataphractii armor. So they were both replaced by a cheaper and less technologically advanced, I guess, version of themselves. Maybe that's unfair on European knights, but I do think of them as slightly removed from kind of the pinnacle of Cataphract warfare. And so that's interesting to see, right? And kind of speaks to the decline of the Middle Ages, but also of humanity in the 41st millennium. I think it's a shame because personally I love the classics, and that's why I have so many on the battlefield in my force. I guess one final interesting comparison that I did come across as I was researching this was people suggesting that perhaps cataphracts were an early influence, I guess, for tanks on the battlefield. I don't know if I 100% buy that as a theory. Tanks are really, or were really developed as a response to trench warfare in the First World War, and that was largely inspired by Winston Churchill, who hopefully I'll be able to cover in a future video. But I can certainly see how, heavily armored, fully enclosed, fast-moving units on the battlefield could be seen to be, some loose general lines tied between them. Whether I can draw a direct solid line between large units of heavily armored horse archers or cavalry-based soldiers, and modern tanks rolling through deserts, I'm not sure, but it's an interesting theory anyway, and something to leave you with, to hopefully have something to think about there. As always, please follow, like, subscribe, comment below. I am super keen to start covering the topics that you want to see, the things that you find interesting. I want to know where I've missed things, where there's things that hopefully I could elaborate on. So the conversation will hopefully continue down below, and I really appreciate you tuning in for another History of the Far Future. I promise I'll be back soon and next time. But until then, ka kite. Talk to you soon.